Dr. Alexander Hayes was the epitome of success. As the world's top neurosurgeon, he had everything he could ever desire: a lucrative career, a multi-million-dollar penthouse in New York City, and a reputation that placed him at the pinnacle of his field. He was known not just for his surgical skill, but for his unwavering confidence, some would say arrogance. At 38, he had accomplished what many only dreamed of: performing complex surgeries that others deemed impossible and saving countless lives in the process. Alexander thrived on the admiration of his peers and the praise of the medical community. However, one night Alexander attended a grand event held in his honor, where he was celebrated with yet another prestigious award for his contributions to neurosurgery. The room was filled with esteemed colleagues, aspiring surgeons, and influential figures in medicine, all eager to congratulate him. But Alexander's mind was elsewhere. He basked in the limelight, but his words were laced with arrogance as he brushed off those who sought his advice. One young neurosurgeon approached him, full of admiration and seeking guidance, but Alexander's response was sharp and dismissive. "You'll never catch up to me," he said with a smirk. "You need another lifetime to reach my level." The young surgeon's face fell, but Alexander didn't care. He was untouchable, or so he thought. Later that night, Alexander left the event and drove his Porsche through the winding roads that led to his penthouse. The city lights blurred as he sped through the streets, his mind still buzzing with the accolades he had received. But as he rounded a sharp curve, disaster struck. Out of nowhere, a car veered into his lane, and before he could react, the two vehicles collided head-on. The force of the impact was catastrophic. Alexander's Porsche was pushed off the road, tumbling down an embankment before coming to a violent stop. The world went dark, and the last thing he felt was a searing pain in his hands, the very hands that had brought him fame and fortune. When Alexander awoke, he found himself in a hospital bed, surrounded by sterile white walls and the faint hum of medical equipment. His body ached, but it was the numbness in his hands that sent a jolt of fear through him. Panic set in as he tried to move his fingers, but they barely responded. A doctor entered the room, his expression grave. "Dr. Hayes," he began, "you've been in a serious accident. We did everything we could, but the damage to your hands, it's extensive. I'm afraid you'll never fully regain control." Alexander's world shattered in an instant. His hands, the hands that had performed miracles, that had saved lives, were now useless. The doctor's words echoed in his mind, and a deep sense of despair took hold. How could this be happening? How could he, the great Dr. Alexander Hayes, be reduced to this? The days that followed were a blur of pain, frustration, and hopelessness. Alexander underwent surgery after surgery, each one a desperate attempt to restore function to his hands. But the reality was inescapable. His hands, once the best in the world, were now a liability. His career as a neurosurgeon was over. Visitors came and went, offering their condolences and support, but Alexander shut them all out. He couldn't bear to face the people who had once looked up to him, the people he had belittled and dismissed. How could he, a man who had everything, now be pitied? He pushed everyone away, retreating into a shell of bitterness and anger. Months passed, and Alexander's physical recovery was slow and agonizing. The once confident and celebrated surgeon was now a shadow of his former self, consumed by the loss of his identity. The man who had been at the top of his field struggled with the simplest of tasks, his hands trembling with every movement, as the world that had once been at his feet was now out of reach, and Alexander was drowning in self-pity. He had once been surrounded by people who admired and respected him, but now his isolation was almost complete. The colleagues he had been so dismissive of had moved on with their lives, while Alexander remained stuck in a cycle of anger and regret. His penthouse, once a symbol of his success, had become a prison where he wallowed in his misery. But not everyone abandoned him. A few of the young surgeons he had belittled still came to visit, despite his cold reception. Among them was Dr. Emily Carter, a talented neurosurgeon who had once looked up to Alexander as a mentor, despite his harsh words. She came to see him regularly, bringing books and trying to engage with him in conversation. But Alexander's bitterness kept her at arm's length. One day, however, Emily arrived with a book on neuroplasticity, hoping to spark some interest in Alexander. "I thought you might find this interesting," she said, placing the book on the table beside his bed. "It's about how the brain can rewire itself, even after a severe injury. There's still hope, Dr. Hayes." Alexander barely glanced at the book, his anger boiling over. "Why do you keep coming here?" he said. "I'm finished. I'm no use to anyone anymore." You should be focusing on your own career, not wasting your time on me." But Emily didn't back down. She met his gaze with quiet determination. "Because I care, Dr. Hayes. You may not see it now, but you still have so much to offer. Your life isn't over just because you can't operate anymore." Alexander was taken aback by her words. For the first time, he saw the kindness and compassion in her eyes, something he had been overlooking with his arrogance. But the pain of his loss was still too raw, and he turned away, unable to accept her words. As the days turned into weeks, Alexander couldn't shake Emily's words from his mind. Despite his best efforts to push her away, she kept coming back, her unwavering support slowly chipping away at the walls he had built around himself. She continued to bring in books and articles on neuroplasticity and rehabilitation, gently encouraging him to explore new possibilities. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Alexander picked up the book Emily had brought him and began to read. The concept of neuroplasticity intrigued him, the idea that the brain could adapt and find new pathways even after severe trauma. It was a glimmer of hope, something he had been desperately searching for. Over the next few weeks, Alexander threw himself into the study of neuroplasticity and rehabilitation. He started working with a physical therapist, determined to regain as much function in his hands as possible. The progress was slow, and there were many setbacks. For the first time since the accident, Alexander felt a sense of purpose. Emily continued to visit, and their conversations became more frequent and meaningful. She shared her own experiences and struggles as a young surgeon, and Alexander found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone else. He realized that she wasn't just being kind out of pity. She genuinely respected him and believed in his ability to overcome this challenge. As Alexander's hands began to improve, so did his outlook on life. He knew that he would never be able to perform surgery again, but he began to see other ways he could contribute to the field of medicine. He started mentoring young surgeons, sharing his knowledge and experience with them in a way that he had never done before. It was a new role, one that he had never considered, but it brought him a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't felt in a long time. The months passed, and Alexander continued to make progress, both physically and emotionally. His hands, while not fully recovered, had regained enough function for him to live independently. But more importantly, he had found a new sense of purpose in his life. He had begun teaching at a medical school, sharing his expertise with the next generation of neurosurgeons. His reputation had changed as well. No longer was he being seen as the arrogant, untouchable surgeon. He was now respected for his resilience and his willingness to help others. The students and young doctors he had once dismissed now looked up to him as a mentor and a role model. Emily remained a constant presence in his life, and their friendship deepened into something more. She had shown him kindness and compassion when he was at his lowest, and in doing so, she had helped him rediscover the man he was meant to be. They often spent their time together outside of the hospital, exploring the city and discussing their hopes and dreams for the future. One day, as they sat in the park together, Alexander reflected on the journey he had been on since the accident. "I used to think that my life was over when I lost the ability to operate," he said quietly. "But now I see that it was just the beginning of a new chapter. I've learned that there's more to being a doctor than just performing surgeries. It's about making a difference in people's lives in whatever way you can." Emily smiled, taking his hand in hers. "You've always had the ability to make a difference, Alexander. It just took you a while to see it." As they sat together watching the sun set over the city, Alexander felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in a long time. He had faced the greatest tragedy of his life and came out stronger on the other side. He knew that there would still be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them with Emily by his side. Alexander had found a new path, one that was different from what he had ever envisioned, but one that was just as fulfilling. He was no longer defined by his ability to perform surgery. He was defined by his resilience, his compassion, and his commitment to making a difference in the world. And in that, he had found a purpose that was more meaningful than anything he had ever imagined.